Well, both RTCA and EuroK have been actively involved in the development of software standards for many years. Other standard organizations have been involved as well. And so I'm pleased to be joined today by Mr. Brian Meincke, the Vice President for Global Development and Innovation at ASTM, and Mr. David Alexander, the Director of Aerospace Standards at SAE. Gentlemen, welcome to our event this week.
Thank you.
So we've got about 15 minutes for this segment. So I'd like to first start out by asking each of you a couple of questions. First of all, at a high level, what is your approach to software standards development today? Brian, why don't you go first, and then David?
Well, thank you, Terry, and thank you for this opportunity. I know we have a short period of time, but I think we would all be remiss if we didn't thank the technical experts that are members and participate in our respective standards developing organizations. And I think that's the model that makes all of our organizations very successful to do their aviation and aerospace standards development work. So I just want to reach out and say thank you to our technical experts. So at a very high level, our approach to standards development today with regard to software standards development is really primarily focused on aligning requirements and processes on the lower end of the safety continuum. So whether it's UAS, light sport aircraft, or general aviation, we've developed standards that are really tailored for that end of the safety continuum. So we have specific standards that are related to system level verification that can be used for some general aviation applications, as well as the FAA durability and reliability means of compliance for low risk UAS. I was pleased to see the poll in the previous panel that a lot of our audience is focused here on UAS and general aviation. And I think a lot of the standards work that's happened in ASTM is focused in those areas because of our respective robust portfolio in those respective areas.
Great. David?
Thanks very much, and again, thanks Terry and Christian for the invitation to speak at this event. Much appreciated. I think it's essentially the process of software standards development. It does follow the open consensus process among the technical experts, as Brian had mentioned, with software development and related knowledge. The approach is to make sure that the standard provides the necessary guidance to develop the software for a given new paradigm to fulfill the expected requirements with a view to certification and with safety absolutely paramount. I think it's important to note that, and I think this will be discussed further in the program, it's really important. This has also been bringing in new expertise and entrants into the aviation consensus standards process. It's been a great opportunity, and we're really seeing the value of this. For example, we're benefiting from important technical expertise and leadership from new entrants and what we might deem non-traditional technology centers for aviation, both software companies expanding into aviation, eVTOL manufacturers and startups that will help to pioneer these new techniques. So you have the technology and the application. And I think the conversations in the last panel on where standards can accommodate agile development was excellent, and that's another important aspect. It's the iterative process required, taking inspiration from the software world, so that our committees can work smartly and efficiently in this very dynamic and changing environment in software, so that we can get usable consensus standards content out in phases, not slow the process down by waiting to address every possible element at once. And as an example, the first version of the G34WG114 AI process standard will create processes and means of compliance for offline ML solutions. But this phase isn't considering adaptive algorithms. That will be for future phases.
Okay. So David, what are some of the factors that you see that are influencing your work in standards development?
I think there are a few things which are at the fore today. There's of course, the ever increasing role of software in society, and again in aviation. That, of course, brings learning, brings the opportunity for synergies as well. Again, some of the discussions from the last panel on the use of COTS, looking at other sectors like automotive, where we can bring some of these things in, of course, at the right safety level. There's then the paradigm of non-deterministic applications and machine learning, and there's also the role of software itself in standards. And an example of this is our AS4 Unmanned Systems Committee, which has developed standards with code, and it's therefore a new usage paradigm of the content. Interestingly, that's another path that starts to lead us towards digital and interactive standards. And I'd also note the role of government and research as being critical in supporting these efforts through some high-level initiatives, through R&D, guidance and some roadmaps, for example, the EASA AI roadmap, Eurocontrol's Fly AI reports, AVSI's machine learning report, and the anti-UAS roadmap, which are really, really useful inputs and I think ongoing collaborative exercises for our committees.
Brian, what about at ASTM? What are some of those factors that are influencing your work?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And just to highlight some of the things that David was mentioning back on with regard to the first approach, I think it's interesting. I think how you assemble and utilize technical experts in the case of software standards development is key. You know, David mentioned the new entrants coming into the marketplace. They're not very familiar always with standards development. So I think that's a key factor with regard to the playing field and making sure that they're up to speed with regard to how the standards development process works. A lot of the discussions that we talked about previously in the previous panel was about how do you address shorter design cycles? And I think that's key from a standpoint is how do you marry a shorter design cycle from the technology standpoint and the software standpoint to a standards development process, and without compromising the quality of the technical content and of course the safety side of things. So I know a lot of our organizations, whether it's SAE or ASTM, are looking at different models of how do we accelerate not just the standards development cycle, but how do we marry that? And I think the last mention that David mentioned with regard to research and the ability to marry research to standards is key. And that's been a key program for both ASTM and SAE and others, is how do we marry the two communities together? The R&D community that's happening in software development is not necessarily familiar, like I mentioned, with standards development, and how do we marry those two communities together?
Yeah, I think that's really important because I would say research and development is kind of the precursor to standards, and having that connection is really important. Before we go on, I'm going to ask the audience a question. So if you can go to your Q&A section on Slido, I'd like to ask the audience a question. What applications of new software standards are needed right now? So you can input your answers into that Q&A section. You can upvote them, and we'll kind of review those at the end of our segment. We'd kind of like to see what you, the audience, are thinking where software standards are needed today. So with that, Brian, what are some of the applications of standards that you're developing right now?
Well, I think that's a loaded question, Terry, and because I think all the buzzwords are out there with regard to machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the connectivity technologies that are out there with regard to how do they all work together. But I would say a lot of the focus where ASTM is focused is on autonomy. And our approach to autonomy in the aviation and aerospace space has been really how do you assemble and how do you bring together and connect all of the relevant technical committees together. So we've formed our own, what we call administrative committees, to really focus on these new emerging technologies and applications for the standards that might be used. And we have some examples of how we've used it. I mentioned our F3153 in my opening statement in general aviation and how that's used in some of the avionics systems and the work that's being done there. We also have F3269, which is, and I don't want to throw out numbers, but that's our standard practice for methods to safely bound flight behavior of UAS containing complex functions. And we use that to garner a lot of attention used in research and development of systems containing artificial intelligence and machine learning. So there's a lot of different factors with regard to the applications that are being used for standards in this area.
David, what about at SAE? What are some of the applications and standards you're developing?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And I'll kind of talk about maybe even a little more deeply about some of the work that's going on in the SAE EUROCAE joint work on AI. So aviation applications incorporating AI machine learning algorithms on both airborne and ground-based systems. So they're working on a process standards, G34 and WG114, that will support the development of aviation software with machine learning elements. So several, and I think that this is where it gets quite exciting. There are several and quite varied use cases that have been identified for its application, from go-around prediction to engine fault detection. I think going further, and this is maybe something for some of the experts, I think further on into the program to talk about, certainly with more authority, but there are use cases for reinforcement learning to identify more gaps and challenges down the road.
What, David, what do you see any adjacent technologies that are influencing software standards today?
Certainly, and I think that my answer will be very similar to Brian's last, and it's something that all of our organisations are working on behalf of the industry, indeed with and for the industry, and that's a trend towards more autonomy, automation, reduced pilot functions, depending on the application, the aircraft type, the operation, and so on. And these, this is really exciting. It's really important. It's also obviously safety critical. And so these developments are influencing the importance of, and indeed the reliance on, software standards. And I think that's why forums such as this summit and these discussions are so important.
Great. I'm just looking at the Q&A, and it looks like things that are being brought up in the Q&A are standards for wireless, cybersecurity, and obviously machine learning, artificial intelligence, which we've certainly talked about. In our remaining few minutes, the three of us, we've talked quite a bit over the last year or so about not only the things that we're doing individually, but how collectively we're contributing to the entire industry in terms of whether it's software or whatever it is. Brian, any comments on your view on that, and how we're really kind of developing that full landscape for aviation?
Well, I think you and Christian kind of couched it in your opening fireside chat that you had with regard to it's all about collaboration. And I think why we're here and why we're assembled here today is because of the success of that collaboration that we've had, not just amongst ourselves in the standards developing organizations, but also with the regulators as well. I'm always happy to see that we also started our own coordination activities, for example, with the FAA and having a standards update quarterly meeting. But I'm also pleased that, that we're doing a lot of this. We're entering into a lot of memorandums of understanding between our organizations. And we're trying to, what I would say is best utilize our technical resources. As we all know, the technical resources sometimes are slim with regard to how much expertise there is, and we're asking them to participate in a lot of different venues. And I think if we do a good job of managing the expectations and managing the venues and where we can maximize that, I think that's works well for what we're trying to accomplish in the standards development space around whether it's software standards or any of the other aviation and aerospace standards that are being developed out there. And then also just how it also can lead to the other areas. For example, David mentioned human factors, communication types of standards as well. And I would say that we're always open to, if someone is not represented here, who else do we need to invite to the table in order to participate? And I think that's an important key factor, identifying where some of that key work is happening.
Okay. David, your thoughts?
I think very similar. I mean, what we kind of collectively provide, whether we're working jointly or whether there's coordinated standardization, it's part of that kind of rich tapestry of recommended practices and standards and guidance that industry and the authorities can use and rely on. I think it's worth noting, as we're talking about things like AI and machine learning and ultimately autonomy and automation applications. It's worth noting the importance and the role of the software consideration, software certification standards, DO 178 and ED 12, which are obviously going to be talked about extensively, together with development assurance and safety assessment recommended practices, ARP 4754 ED 9 and the associated portfolio. So it's looking at that canvas where we build, where we adapt, and where we can bring in these different tools and applications to enable the industry to move forward within the regulatory framework. And of course, we're always with the safety case.
Great. Well, as we've talked about before, there's plenty of work to go around when it comes to standards development. And the more that we can collaborate together and figure out where our individual expertises could best be applied, where we can work together to close up any gaps in our standards, all is going to be very helpful, I think, to not only to the industry, but to the regulators as well. And we all work in an international environment, which also helps towards that harmonization. That's so important. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon. I think that's some great information for our audience. Appreciate you all being a part of our software summit today. So thank you.